Okay, Ethan Zuckerman, what was your big takeaway from this?
Well, it's really interesting to be sitting here as the federal government seems to be lurching towards default, and it's very unclear whether we're actually going to default on sovereign debt, which it was almost unthinkable months ago, but seems very possible at the moment. And at the same time, we've got about 450 people here who really do believe that governments can do things and seem to be working very, very hard to have governments make modest but significant improvements in the world. And for me, it's this really interesting example of idealism at scale. You have really bright people working really, really hard to make changes that are important, but they're small. They aren't changing the nature of government as we know it. They're changing whether we can keep track of people in the prison system and who's out on a temporary furlough and what jail they're in. And that's important, and it's significant. It's significant that people in South Bend, Indiana get to look at urban blight. But what I'm really interested in is people sort of trading the dream of fixing everything. And I think that was something that was very much associated with the early internet, with the very practical hard work of figuring out how do we make that small but achievable improvement. So I've been talking a lot lately about this idea almost of like a pointillist version of civics, where you basically say, I'm not going to solve everything. I don't have the big problem. I'm going to have the issues that I can work on, that I feel like that I can be effective and have a real impact on. And that's sort of what I see here. I see people taking the time to actually understand just how complicated, how nuanced these problems actually are, and make that achievement. And on the one hand, you could walk away from this and essentially say, okay, the prisons get a little better, we have a little less urban blight. Mm-hmm. The flip side is these things actually get done and things actually happen. And so maybe that's a really hopeful vision in the long run. Maybe there's a way that these sort of small changes lead up to something extremely big.
Is there a risk that all the small improvements, which feel good and can genuinely help people, right? Helping parents make better choices about schools, track buses, understand what's happening in their, as you say, prison populations, to create better opportunities for people to engage with government. Though, is there a risk that we then distract from not being able to solve big problems? That all those little pricks, and improvements and tweaks don't, not only don't change the big things, but distract from needing to.
So I like writing and talking and thinking about the big stuff. I just wrote a post about why the U.S. has a systemic problem with public goods, and it is nice here that many of these conversations have been about public goods. They're not always sexy public goods. They're sewers and prisons. They're not necessarily the big ones. So I want to make sure that we do have those big conversations. But those big conversations feel really intractable right now. I just wrote this long post about why I can't do my commute via train. And basically, we're at a moment where it seems very, very hard to get America at the federal level to consider things like infrastructure. But actually, I think it's very reassuring that there are investments being made in infrastructure, in public goods, at these sort of small, local levels. So I don't know. I think the flipped version to your question is there a way that we can get inspired by things that happen at a local level and scale it up to a state level and then potentially up to a federal level? Because the other way around isn't working. Having that sort of conversation about should government be small enough to drown in a bathtub, or should government have the big dreams and the big ambitions that it had in the 1960s, we don't seem to be able to have that as a mature conversation right now. So maybe we can have a conversation about whether Louisville is a compassionate city or whether South Bend needs smart sewers and what you could do with smart sewers. And then if it turns out that smart sewers are really important, maybe we could figure out a way to scale that to Kentucky and then to the region and then to the nation as a whole. I certainly admit that it's not as glamorous and shiny a vision as let's make giant change at the federal level. But it seems a whole lot more practical at this moment in time.
So is that the big takeaway from the moment in terms of how civic tech and civic media is changing to really approach what can be changed right now through concerted efforts of citizens as opposed to trying to change the system?
This is what I see in civics as a whole.
Okay.
So I see there's a lot of people who sort of talk about a crisis in civics, and they usually track voting in nationwide elections as a way to sort of look at it. And my response in general is to sort of say, well, sure, if you measure it one way, there might be a crisis in civics, but if you measure this in other ways, it looks like a golden moment for civics. And the other way that it comes into play is that you have people focusing on issues where they have personal passion and they feel like they have the ability to have impact. And sometimes those are hyper-local, sometimes those are national, sometimes those are international. But it's playing to people's passions and it's playing to effectiveness. It's really playing to the question of what people can get done. I think what's going on with Code for America is that you have this sort of interesting meeting of passions. You have people who are really passionate about the idea that code can change the world. Your passionate people in city governments really believe that making modest, measurable, achievable increases is how people keep their faith in cities and how cities keep their promises. And when those groups come together, it's really tough at first. I mean, none of these projects go smoothly at first. It's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. But then there's this sort of shared passion of what can we actually do, what can we actually deliver in this city. And it strikes me as not unlike the most exciting sort of social media campaigns, petition campaigns, citizen-run fair trade campaigns I've seen, where people pick off an issue that they can have an achievable win on. And I think at a moment where it seems so hard to win any victory at the national level, this notion of the achievable win and engagement that actually leads to a tangible outcome, I think it's a great lesson to take from this.
Okay, thanks. And if people want to learn more about the research you're doing, where should they go online?
Sure, civic.mit.edu. That's the Center for Civic Media at MIT's Media Lab.
All right, Ethan Zuckerman, thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me.